Mhm.
And it's one of the consequences of just racism and discrimination is that hypervigilance. Yeah, and we're always, our autonomic nervous system is activating, we're stressed, heart rate increase, cortisol production, and over time it's exhausting. And then we think about like the health consequences, like why do we have high rates of like hypertension and cardiovascular disease? And it's some of that is in response to just experiencing just racism and that hypervigilance of always trying to be safe. You never know.
Wow, I did not know that. That makes sense though. The next question, Marley, I would start off with you. What patterns have your research, what patterns has your practice uncovered regarding how it affects communities of color?
Like how racism affects communities of color.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a term they call racial trauma, and intergenerational trauma. And trauma in general is this experience of like just feeling unsafe and having your safety be threatened, having a part of your livelihood be threatened. And I think a lot of times when we talk about trauma, we don't think about the different ways that our livelihoods are threatened just by those little small things. So like, potentially potentially losing a job can be traumatic. Potentially, and it's the idea of what could happen is also what's stressful. So, all of the collective grief around police brutality, around having to be a certain way and not, be closer to whiteness with how we wear our hair, how we, put clothes on our bodies, or how we speak in certain spaces, professional spaces. All of that extra work that goes into, creating this mask, like Mr. Pate was talking about, this double consciousness. It takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of work, and it's exhausting. And it's a lot of folks don't really realize that we're doing it. And so in my practice, a lot of the work is around being aware and trying to be mindfully aware of your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions at any given moment. And trying to care for yourself when you notice, okay, I don't feel safe in this moment. Why did I feel like I needed to change how I was speaking, to this person? Why did I feel like, I was being chased on the highway, when no one's following me? And so this kind of, all of the messages that we receive around who we are, just create a great deal of stress that is overwhelming to people, and it changes the way we often blame ourselves. And so a lot of the work that I do is kind of helping folks to be aware of the context that we're operating in, and that it's not all on us. Like for the example that I gave before around everyone comes to me and says, why don't Black folks do this? Why don't Black folks go to therapy? Why don't Black folks go to the doctor? Well, if you consider the context, there's a lot of reasons why we don't. And so, the validation that comes with that is really, really powerful. And, the more that we can do that, not only in therapy, but then, as a community, it's really important.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely feel like the extra worry. I was just telling one of my friends that for most of my jobs as an adult, like I would always have the fear that I would be fired.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not even like I'm doing a great job. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, but I'm always like a meeting with my supervisor. Oh my God, this is it. Like they're gonna fire me today. That extra anxiety. Yeah, it's there.
And then just the ability to like speak your truth in spaces where your truth is not often welcome. Like I have definitely almost actually been fired for saying some things that were true, that were my truth. And I've heard that from so many people. And so that, holding in and repressing who you are, yeah, it just doesn't serve anyone.
It does not. It's a lot to carry and act like everything is fine at the same time. Yeah. I will pose the question also to you, Alex. What patterns has your research uncovered regarding education and racism, and how does it affect our communities of color?
Well, it's profound, and it extends across the board in education in general. I mean, for example, if it's not clear, Innocent Classroom is a training program in which we train teachers to help our children separate themselves from the impact of negative stereotypes, negative iconography, and negative narratives so that they can begin to exist in a classroom free. In the first exercise in our training, we asked teachers to tell us what America tells them about Black children. Not what they think, but what they are told or shown by the culture. And you can imagine what comes back to us. Children are gang members, violent, disrespectful, drug users, dealers, promiscuous. I mean, and that's just a very small snippet. I mean, again, it's right back to what Dr. James was talking about. Those stereotypes exist large in the consciousness of the American population. And unfortunately, teachers are part of that population. They don't walk in with that intent. It's unconscious, it's an absorption. It's almost like the absorption of toxicity. And no matter who the teacher is or what they feel about our children, they have to first overcome those feelings about our children to effectively love them, to embrace and to teach them effectively. And I will never eliminate the word love from that relationship between our children and their educators. And think about this. If our children are impacted by if our teachers are impacted by these stereotypes, you have to know that our children are as well. In fact, many of our children basically expect their educators to believe that the stereotypes about them are actually real, which they are not. And our children begin to internalize all of that and begin to perform along those lines. I call this guilt. Not guilt born from action, but guilt laid upon our children that causes them, not because they've done anything bad, but because these stereotypes make them feel that way. And if you really get into the research, recent studies on the impact of stereotypes on children are frightening. Our children may not try as hard because they don't expect anybody to expect them to try hard. They may not believe education can change their lives. They may feel that bad behavior doesn't really matter since their futures are already decided. It can have a myriad of unfortunate outcomes. But when a teacher is able to help a child disconnect from this vicious cycle and a child comes to feel a kind of freedom from those guilts, everything changes. Everything changes. This I know because this is the work that we do. And it tells me children who engage in an environment where those stereotypes are not active change academically and behaviorally. In the districts and schools in which we've worked, we've seen graduation rates grow, relationships grow, and discipline issues diminish. It does change. When a child feels like they can look at you and see that you care about them, truly care about them, where it's based on something organic and authentic that derives from within that child and isn't artificial laid on that teacher's consciousness by a stereotype or, where it's authentic and original, organic, a child will change. Our children are I have a phrase, it doesn't pop into my head right now, but they are, defenseless against love. Our children are defenseless against love. But it's really hard to get to that spot if you're an authority over them, because you've got to go through, those stereotypes. the first thing I work with educators is to get them to see that's a barrier to you. The negative stereotypes about my children have to do with you and your ability to get over those stereotypes to see who my child actually is. And I'm going to help you do that.
I love that. I love that. I feel like flipping the table, like, yes, no, that's 100%. My sister always talks about how the achievement gap is the resource gap and how language is really important into naming things for what they are. And it's not that it's not the lack of the effort from our children, but it's the lack of resources that they presented.
And the way they've been oriented to engage in the process of academic engagement.
Yeah. I remember when I was at story time, I'm gonna go into story time every time I hear something that triggers it. So I was in 6th grade and I still love science. And I remember I'd like got an A in a test that I was new to the school. It was like a weekend, we had a test, I got an A. And I just remember like rumblings from my classmates, like, oh, she cheated. There's no way she got an A, or like, you know, and even like the teacher never said anything, but like she was accusing me of like cheating. And yeah, just how like, you know, always being on the defense for your intelligence, it's like tiring at times. Yeah. Dr. Drexler.
No, and I'll just piggyback. I think that was like very well said. And I'll piggyback on my opening quote. Like, if you're told over and over that you're not going to succeed, in like some like internalized mental illness stigma, there's like this why try phenomenon. Like, if I'm not going to succeed, why put in the effort? And, you know, there's also this like hopelessness that comes there. But in my research, I really focus on some of like the psychological and behavioral consequences of internalizing those stereotypes. So here we have in the academic context, but I just focus on like just broadly. So people who internalize those negative stereotypes about their racial group, so thinking about like African-American adults, report lower self-esteem, report lower self-efficacy, increased psychological distress, increased feelings of hopelessness that all have downstream mental health consequences. It also influences their attitudes towards seeking care. So people who internalize racism express less positive attitudes towards seeking psychological care and services. But although, you know, I focus on this like more individual intrapersonal consequence of racism, I always have people think about the larger context. Yeah, let's think about structures. What are the structures that are contributing or allowing for this internalization of racism? And especially when we think about just like false narratives, sometimes think about those like false beliefs about like Black people being strong, you know, and that's beliefs in their strength might lead us to not seek help because we're supposed to be strong. So adding that like layer of just like risk, we have to think about where did these narratives come from and who created those narratives that Black people are strong. We can maybe think about slavery and why that narrative was important to maintaining like slavery then. So thinking about like where these things come from have been interesting to me. But I also, yeah, it's like, even think about like Black childhood. I remember reading a paper, you know, Black children have childhood, don't really have a childhood. Then I thought about the stereotypes about Black children and Black adults. They're the same, they overlap. You see less overlap with stereotypes about white children and white adults. It had me thinking, I think the argument in the paper was that Black children never really had a childhood because time you can walk, you're working on the plantation. So you had like, you know, a whole narrative constructed around just like Black children. And I think today we're still seeing that. And I became really much interested in how the US context kind of shifts psychologically. I came here when I was 18. So I was in a country from St. Lucia where, you know, the doctors are Black, my teachers were Black, everyone is Black. I never really thought about not achieving. And then I came to the US even as an adult. And, you know, I was learning about all these things I'm supposed to be and not supposed to be. And slowly I found myself sometimes internalizing it's like negative stereotypes, even as an adult, even when I didn't believe it, you know, I was still high achieving academically and all that, but sometimes it still like sips in, especially when my guard is like down. But you can't always have a heart, you know, guard up. It's exhausting. It's exhausting to always think about this stereotype. It's exhausting to not always want to confirm this stereotype. It's exhausting when you can't be yourself. because you know that you'll always be like perceived in this like racialized lenses. So that's what my research is really trying to uncover. How can we like think about just like the psychological consequences of racism and how it gets into our minds? Like for a lot of us, we know it's there, we know it's happening, but oftentimes it's unconscious. And I sometimes will, I think you use the word guilty sometimes about the experience, but I know it's not about me. You know, it's not the thing that I am doing. This is the thing that like racism is doing to me. So that's my personal part. I'm getting like all excited about this discussion.
Oh,
Anyway,
please
thank
do.
you.
Well, some of us, I just want to say, some of us get lost in that completely. We lose ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the trauma, we get lost in the trauma of all of that, and we never get back to the place where we are fighting against something. We're sort of swimming along or floating along or being swept along by this stream that is carrying us. It's a really, I mean, it's yeah. I don't know what else to say. It's like the challenge is to hold forth to yourself.
It is a lifelong struggle. Dr. Mahmoud Al-Kati always says that we are people and we are Black people. Like we are people first and then we're Black people. And I think that's a thing that it's hard to forget. The third question, I will start off with you, Alex. How does history inspire, influence, inform your work today?
Well, I guess, I mean, this is one that I feel like, I came to this work as a writer. I was a professor of African-American lit, teaching creative writing in the English department and in African-American studies. And so, I mentioned Du Bois earlier. He also asked, what does it mean to be a problem? And I think this idea of us as a problem is a challenging one that we have to outrun, every day, or in the context of our culture and community. It's like we are always looking up and we see ourselves reflected back as problems. The history of Black folks in America has been a troubled and vexed one. Slavery, all of that, this racism that is ongoing. Sometimes like there's abatements and moments of joy or whatever, but it's constantly there that we have to acknowledge and deal with. That's what I meant by getting lost. There are moments when you can figure it out and see a pathway for yourself. And then there are times when history overwhelms us. The challenge to use our history of figuring out ways of, the challenge is to use our history as a way of figuring out ways of living and surviving throughout all of this. So like the work that I'm doing, the work that Dr. James is doing, the work that Marley is doing, we are all trying to figure out a way to use what we have and what's available to us against the history that we have been brought into, so that we can create a new future. In my case, a future for Black kids, for kids of color, in such a way that we're able to actually do stuff. Like there also is ways in which, you can be trapped and get caught up in a cycle. Like, no, the work that we do, that I'm doing, and I perceive that is being done is a work that has to do with rescuing, with salvation, with freeing people, with making history fall away as history, as opposed to the future. We have to solve the education crisis, first of all. And history tells us that. And our scholars and our thinkers and intellects have been trying to deal with this since we began education. Somebody mentioned Sojourner Truth. All of that is real. That was a part of the libation. All of I wrote Amistad, so I'm very familiar with history and the evolution of Black folks in this country, and that journey is ongoing, and we are just pieces of that as we move forward. At heart, as I said, I'm a writer, so I wear the history of my ancestors tightly. I'm influenced by James Baldwin, by Langston Hughes, by Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Richard Wright, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and literally hundreds of scholars and activists. All of them focused on what the quote you used, you talked about, Mahmoud El-Khatib talks about us being people first. Well, all of them focused on humanity, the humanity of Black folks in this country and globally. But rendering our children human and convincing them that they are in fact valuable and necessary must be one of our highest objectives. That is the challenge that we face. And to me, history lights our way. It also marks all the holes in the ditches and the trenches that we've had to overcome to do this work. But, you know, I just feel a conversation like this is very uplifting, because I get the sense that we are constant, and we have always constantly caught the threads of life and humanity and pulled ourselves up, and we will continue to do that.
I love that. I love that. I'm honestly trying to contain my energy and like not clap while you're speaking. But I love that. Yeah, I love how you said history has, like, we have to figure out a way, like, have a way for history to fall away. And I totally agree, because better future is possible for like everything that racism has or race has touched. And I feel like when Black folks and like when people talk about race and racism and the systematic effects that it has on all of us, a lot of people kind of get discouraged or are like, let's not talk about it. But if we don't face it, and if we don't address it, then nothing can be created.
It's also easy to believe in the future when you're talking about children, right? Because I'm working with educators and our children, I can't afford to become cynical or apathetic or hope. That's ridiculous, because our children need everything that we can give them and every advantage that they can get. And even if it comes from our work to help them, as opposed to the system is a fright, right? The system will do our children are doing our children damage right now. Right now, as we're speaking, children are in schools and not learning what they need to learn.
Yep.
That's a fact. I don't blame teachers for that, but somehow we have to rescue them and work to get through this.
We can. It's possible.
And we can. We have to. Like, what choice is there?
Mm-hmm.
That's history.
I love it. I love it. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. James, I'll pose it to you. How does history inspire? And you kind of touched on this too, which blew my mind, of like how the strength, how Black people are strong comes from slavery. Makes sense. But how does history inspire, influence, and inform your work today?
Yeah, so primarily we started the one double consciousness. I'm like laughing, because Alex like kind of mentioned that, and thinking about how we construct a Black identity in a context that's like rife with anti-Blackness, and like how the system shape how we think about our identity. And also really informed by the Clark and Clark doll studies in psychology. So it was like in the 60s, they had 200 Black children select from two dolls, a light-skinned doll and a darker-skinned doll, and they had to select the doll they preferred. And 66% of the children in that study picked the lighter-skinned doll as a doll they preferred. And they concluded that it shows how being belonging to a marginalized community influences like self-esteem among children. But I think it's like larger consequences to think about, like internalized racism, internalized colonialism, how we think about like preferences, values, aesthetics, etc., etc. So it's like two, I think, papers that like, well, the book, the concept in the paper shape my work. But more personally, I reflect on like Bob Marley's Redemption song. I used to listen to that song like religiously, but it made me like think about just the internalization of colonialism that's in that song that seeks to dismantle that structure. Where he says, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our mind. And for a time I bought into that, and I thought it was just like, yes, if Black people came together and just like shift the narratives by ourselves and just stop somehow magically from internalizing racism, we'll be good. And it took me a while to get to the point of like, no, this is a structural issue. this is like a legacy of slavery issue. This process is more unconscious than conscious. You know, the average Black person isn't sitting there saying, you know what, randomly I just hate being Black. So let's think about like where those things are like coming from. Yeah, so a lot of my thinking now, although I'm a psychologist, I try to really think of like the historical antecedents and these historical narratives that are now like shifted now in 2022. And I've been just like doing a lot more of that. Like recently I've been thinking about like nose contouring for like women and makeup, and like why it seems to be like the gold standard of like beauty. And it's like, well, yeah, we think about like nose bridges and some of the stereotypes associated there and how that shift, but it's so mainstream now. We don't think about it. We don't think about this like racialized aesthetics because it's just so normalized. So I've been thinking a lot more about like behaviors, like why growing up where people didn't want to stand in the sun if you're a Black person because you get too dark. And it's like, where is this coming from? And why is all these things to like normalize? Just in thinking about it. So yeah, so I've been just really thinking about just like stories because I subscribe to just different ways of knowing. You know, science doesn't always capture our full experiences. And we just like listen to people and their stories and their narratives that inform how we just like think about ways to just dismantle structures.
Thank you.
So that.
Yeah, it's definitely. I didn't even think about the contouring because it's everywhere. Yeah, I'm learning a lot. Thank you. I feel like this could be a monthly podcast with us, y'all. We're dropping some gems. Marley, I would ask you, how does history inspire, influence, and inform your work today?
So for me, history inspires my work just with trying to focus on learning about healing practices, like traditional healing practices. But like throughout the generations, Black folks have been holding on to our own traditional ways of healing that they get passed on in ways that maybe you don't know. Like I remember my grandmother would always say, like, you know, if you I don't know if you guys have heard this, but if you comb your hair, you leave your hair out, or, you know, you throw it out somewhere, you're going to get a headache or something, and a bird's going to make a nest with it or something. And I would hear all of these things that felt like superstitions that have been kind of passed on through generations. And then the more that I learn about it, I'm like, oh, this was from hoodoo. This was from, you know, my people are from South Carolina, Mississippi, Missouri. And so like the practice of like healing during that time was a lot in hoodoo. And so like, I think for me, just kind of trying to root myself in healing practices that are ours, instead of kind of that like white centric space is really important. And so that's what I try to bring into the work. Maybe these things aren't superstitions. Maybe that is, you know, that's wisdom that's being passed down on through the generations. And so, yeah, I try to kind of root myself in that. And so for me, I've been going backwards in history, asking my grandparents, my, you know, family, you know, older family members about what they learned from their grandmothers and their people. And then going back, you know, just learning about you know, enslaved people, the information and the religious and the spiritual practices that they had and that they kept going and kind of hid in Christianity at some points. And so, yeah, that's kind of my key, and that's kind of what continues to drive me is that, you know, even the way that we define healing, it doesn't have to be, you know, in this white centered space. It can be like, okay, I listen to Granny. I listen to, you know, her grandma, her granny, her, you know, her wisdom, their wisdom. So yeah, that's kind of how it inspires my work.
I love that. I know every time I get sick, my mom has weird remedies for me to like one time I had a fever and she cut an onion and then put like half of onions in my sock.
Yep. Yep.
Big fever.
Yep.
It worked. I felt better, but I'm like, I don't know why you know that. Or I could just take like over the counter medication, but like, yeah, she does random stuff like that. I'm like, oh no, this actually works.
And unfortunately, it's one of those things where you kind of had to like hide it, or it was harder to pass those things on because maybe you weren't allowed to speak the language that you spoke, or maybe you weren't allowed to, you had to be Christian. You couldn't use, the spiritual practices that you did in the past. But those things were healing and they continued to be healing. And it sucks because there's this kind of break a lot of the times in at least my generation. I think my parents too, and the further the generations further back. But yeah, this stuff's important.
It is definitely wisdom and knowledge behind all of it. We can take a question from the audience.
Hey, thank you, Wilson. I do have a couple comments and questions. First, Marley, this one's for you. Are you currently accepting clients? And please share your contact information. So I thought I'd share that because it seems like we need you out here.
I am accepting clients, but only a very small amount right now because I don't have the capacity to see a lot of folks. But if you hopefully, if I get the funding, I can hire another therapist. So hoping for that.
Yes.
But yeah, so my information though, my website is revivingroots.therapywellness.com. And then, you can find all of my other stuff there if you go to contact us.
Okay. And what I'll do
Can
really
you put
quick
the
here.
link in the chat?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Thank you. So I'm putting the link here. There we go. And then I'll go to the next question here. There we go. There's the link for Reviving Roots in the chat there. And then we have another statement here and kind of a question. When you share space with people who are narcissists and pathological, and you must be in that space, what are your recommendations for strategies to survive in that space? And it's not really posed to anyone, so feel free to hop in and answer. Any of our
That's a hard
panelists?
one.
It is a hard
one, right?
Go ahead.
And yeah, because my first thought is like, do you have to be there? Like, what makes you have to be in that space? And then I guess my second thought is you'd have to do a lot of self-awareness, just like being aware of yourself on a regular basis, because a lot of times when folks, it's kind of like operating within white society, honestly. If you're not aware of what's going on for yourself, it's easy to take on the feelings and the thoughts of other people. And that becomes dangerous when they don't have your best interest in mind. And so, yeah, I guess my advice, which is, I mean, it's going to take a lot more than this, but try to be self-aware as much as you can.
Definitely. And I have.
It might also be similar.
Can you say that again, Dr. Drexler?
Yeah, I was just gonna say externalize. It's one of the parts when it's like always externalizing the situations and acknowledging that it's not about you. It's not about you. You did nothing wrong. It's about the individual to just preserve like a sense of self. It's about the individual. And I think that helps too, because I've been there. And I do agree too that it's like surviving in like white societies. Sometimes we need to take those like moments of introspection and remind yourself that it's not about me, this is not me. This is the structure. This is whiteness. So yes, I definitely agree.
Definitely. Thank you for adding that, Dr. Drexler. I got two more. how do we address I'm sorry, give me 1 second here. Okay. Is there a better term to use other than racism? We are all of the same race, and I think getting everyone to understand that is important. Using a differential term causes a perception that we are different at the most fundamental level and perpetuates an us and them paradigm. That's just a statement there. So, but the question though, and I think a lot of our audience members want to know, is there a better term to use other than racism?
I was gonna say no. So I don't like.
I'm waiting for you
race
guys.
We know race is a social construct, and I think sometimes we go like all the way with that and like jump in like the ocean. But yes, race is a social construct, but racism has real consequences. Yeah. So we have people who believe that people are different because of their skin tone or their phenotype, but we also have to acknowledge that we have structures that operate this historically and contemporarily under the assumption that we are of different races. So even though we might want to just use a different label, we need a label that really captures the structures that are in place that treats it as though we are different people. So like, I get it. Like, I get, we can all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And that would be great if not for the structures that are in place right now that assumes that we are different races. So race is a social construct, but racism has real consequences. So I'll just say, let's keep the label. Yeah.
Definitely. And one, I must share it because it was in the chat. It is one suggestion was instead of racist or racism was anti-human. Definitely fit. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah,
I had a reaction to it.
We can, anti-human, but it just so happens that like some humans who look a certain way get more of the hate than others. Mm-hmm. And so to capture that, and there's some types of humans that get more hate than others, is under the assumption that they're different, i.e. they're racialized differently, they're ergo racism. So when we think about it, we have to just think about like, there are different groups of humans that people perceive as like different races, and because they perceive them as different races, they put in structures to treat them differently, leading to those different outcomes. So when we think about this, like the etiology of the word, racism captures that.
I also think, I'm just thinking about the response that people have to the word racism, and like I guess as a therapist, I'm always curious about like where these things, like what the reasoning behind or what the emotional like feelings are behind this desire to change the word, because I think for a lot of white folks, the word racist and the word racism, it brings out a sense of defensiveness at times, or a sense of like, I don't know, like a strong discomfort for them. And so, I think, the language is, while language is important, I also think it's important to explore, what is the purpose of changing the language, and who does that language serve? Like, who does changing the language serve? And so, whoever had that question, I would just kind of pose that. That was, I think that's why it took a lot of us a little while to be like, oh, do I want to answer this?
Yeah, I haven't yet reached the point where I feel like I do. It's like language is extremely important to me. I'm a writer. These words have evolved over time. They have meaning. And yes, some words cause some people to feel shame or sadness or anger or whatever. But for some people, these words are truth. Like, it's like, how are we to address an issue? Like, if I want to not be a problem, how do I address how do I erase myself as a problem in this culture if I don't address the reason why I'm seen as a problem and where all this came from? It's like we didn't create this, and the people on this Zoom, on this presentation didn't create this. We inherited this, and yet you can't just sort of wave away a word because it exists. It has meaning. It has substance, and many of us. Now, I do agree that racism equals anti-human. I mean, and I think when I think about it, it made me think about Frantz Fanon, who in Black Skin, White Mask says, "I can stop being Black when you stop being white." I mean, okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? If you can assert your humanity by not embracing certain things that are attributed to being white, for example, then I can let go of my need to be Black and to embrace. I mean, in the sense that we're talking about a binary concept of racism. Anyway, I guess my point is this is a much more complicated conversation than simply coming up with a better word. Words have this history. It's real. It is actually real, even though race is a social construct, even though race does not exist. Really.
Yes.
It's been used so deep, right?
Yeah.
And Mr. Pate, I have another question for you directly. What strategies does the Innocent Project train teachers to use in the classroom to combat the racism inherent in the rest of society?
Yeah,
And
no, that's really an excellent question. I'm happy to have an opportunity to try to answer it. I'll try to do that really quickly. In our work, we identify, I mean, so we say, if you find a child's goodness, if you find their good, the thing for which all other things are done, if you can find the reason why a person is doing what it is they're doing, Aristotle called that good. And so if you can find a person's good and engage that good, then that person, what immediately happens is sympathy springs into existence. And then when that empathy exists, you can begin to, you start to change and that child changes. So I guess what I'm saying is, I thought it was going to be easier than it is. It's not. The work that, in our work, we train teachers to find the good of each child that is in front of them. When they do that, they are able to make a connection with that child that obviates the issues of trauma and race that are circling around them, and that child can begin to bond and form a relationship with that educator in such a way that they are open to being educated.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pate. I appreciate that.
It's in my book.
Definitely. And we will also be sharing a link here towards the end so that we can make sure that we engage in each of our panelists' work and everything of that nature. But I do appreciate that, Mr. Pate, because I tutor and I know that reaching children, especially our babies, and changing the mind frame of how they see themselves, it turns on the light bulb. Most definitely.
Thank you.
Welcome. And I'll go ahead and pass it back to you, Filson.
Thank you, Marvel. Thank you. And I just to wrap up the race, the changing of the word. I just would like to add that race is a social construct. You know, being Black, being white, all that is essentially made up, but it has real consequences, as you mentioned, Alex. And the us and them, it's not something, as you mentioned, was started by any of us, but it needs to be addressed by all of us. And for us to be on the same page and to use the same language, I think that's a quicker way we can get to a conclusion, a solution that works for all of us. But if we're gonna debate like, oh, we shouldn't do this because it makes me feel some type of way, or we shouldn't say this because it's not real, I think it's just gonna divide our attention and make us go into different silos instead of attacking what needs to be done. And you know, language can change, has a lot of power, and it can change a lot of things. So I think knowing what it is and calling it out for what it is helps us get there in the long run, even though it makes you feel nasty, which I totally understand, because isn't a happy subject for anybody, but it's our reality. I have two last questions, and rather than picking on everybody to speak, I'm just going to ask the question, and whoever feels the need to speak can take it away. How can we encourage equitable change to overcome America's long-lasting racial disparities? How can we fix racism, essentially? World hunger, and we could do that next, but we'll start with this.
Right. I can go first. I think, I guess the answer came to me like because of this conversation. I think the more, how do I say this? I think therapists exist in this culture because we don't listen to each other very much. We don't actually like appreciate the feelings of other people as a community, and we don't take the time to actually like regularly have empathy for people. And so, you know, in our culture, in our society, we have therapists. You can go in your little office, you can say all your feelings, and then you can walk out and act like it didn't happen if you choose. I think in order to change the way that we operate and change racism, it requires an actual awareness of your own emotions, of the emotions of others, and you just being able to walk in the shoes of other people, and allowing yourself the discomfort that comes when you're able to take that place, but then also sit with your own experience. I think that a lot of times, a lot of the ways that people are oppressed, or that people oppress others, not just on the terms of race, but gender, sexuality, all of these things come when we don't seem to completely be able to even try to put ourselves in the position of other people and have empathy for other people. And when we're able to do that, and when we continuously make an effort to do that and actually actively listen to folks as they're explaining their experiences, I think that it'll just make life easier. And you know, that's a very therapist-y thing to say, but I think it could solve a lot of issues, and a lot of we wouldn't be having a lot of the conversations that we'd be having right now.
Right.
I'll just add that you're not far off. Research suggests that like increased empathy and like shared reality decreases prejudice and discrimination. So yeah, I think it's like empathy part, and perhaps part of that is like it humanizes others. I think because of this like less cross group contact, it oftentimes mythologizes like other people, especially when in the context of race. Begin to like humanize people with empathy, perspective taking, even like friendships, like meaningful friendships. We see like less stereotyping there too. And I also think that a lot of the changes here needs to be like radical resource redistribution. Like equitable resource distribution is what needs to happen, because I think oftentimes we focus on like the individuals or like the meso level of like groups, but what's really driving all of these disparities are just like structures. When I came to the US, I was shocked, because I'm from a quote unquote third world country. I was shocked that property taxes pay for like schools. And I was like, wait, what? Like the government isn't just like taking all these taxes and distributing it equally across school districts. So that for me was just like so different from my experience. And thinking about like the short end of the stick. If you happen to be raised in a poor neighborhood, you go to under-resourced schools, and because you go to under-resourced schools, you don't get to go to college. That limits like the amount of money you can make, and that like furthers like the stereotype of like Black people being like uneducated. It's like, but let's think about the resources. There's something completely outside the individual. Even though they would have wanted to go to college, they weren't afforded the opportunity to go to college. So thinking about those like resource redistribution. And I also think about, even now with COVID, you know, there were the narratives of like Black people not wanting to get vaccinated. It's like, yeah, I get that. Let's think about like experiments that the government performed in like Black people. Let's think about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. But also let's think about like where the vaccines are available right now. They're not available in these communities. You know what I mean? So people now perhaps have to take half a day off from work or having to travel to go get the vaccine. So we need to talk about like barriers and the access. People live in neighborhoods that do not have grocery stores. Let's think about those like food deserts and it's like lack of investments in these communities and why we see those like physical health disparities. You know, if you don't have fresh fruit, you know, you have to take a bus. I lived in Chicago for 8 years and there were no major grocery stores on the South Side. So you can think about like 10, 15-mile radius of this like no grocery store. So thinking about this like resources, I think is really important there.
Reparations. I will go to the final question. Please share your thoughts or ideas on approaches. Oh, sorry, the text came up. Okay, please share your thoughts or ideas on approaches our community can take to maintain our identity and health.
Can you say that again? Approaches to
in maintaining our identity and health.
I'll just start off by saying I just think it's really important that we figure out a way to really seriously put the needs of our children first, their education first. I realize there are all these things that are going on, but a lot of times when there's social justice actions out and about, I wonder, why are they bypassing the schools? It's like, again, our children are not being served well in some of the schools and I'm not just talking about Minnesota. I guess I should be talking. In fact, I think in Minnesota, it's more likely that they are being served better than they are in some of the other cities that I work in and with educators and students. Our mental health, I saw a question somewhere in the chat earlier about street violence, mental health. And I connect that to what I was talking about in education, the stereotypes that our children are inculcated with early on in their lives lead them to maybe value life a little bit less than they ought to in the course of street engagements. And this is our responsibility to help them and to help to force the system to make a world within a school, the kind of world where children learn to be the best they can be, where their moral and their integrity, their value system, which mirrors their family and mirrors the community's value system, is held and supported and buttressed in such a way that they have a chance to live a long, happy, healthy life. There's no way around the impact of trauma, given the history that we've had in this country. So there will always be need for therapists and health workers and mental care facilities to help us get through all of that, no question about it. But I just feel like our children are left hanging right now. Like there isn't enough support systems forcing the system to support them so that we can support the system that's supporting them. It's either, I mean, I don't, in my work, I look at how many children are slipping through the cracks every day in terms of graduation, in terms of moving up, behavioral, how many children are diagnosed with mental health issues, how many children are being drugged every day in school, are being diagnosed. It's ridiculous what's happening to us. And that needs to change, and we have to make a priority to do that. So for me, at the earliest stage of life, from birth to like 5th grade, We need to be in the system big time.
Thank you.
I think from my perspective, a lot of the work as a therapist that I do is to try to help folks create community around their healing. And so, you know, my work is to work myself out of a job, you know, that people have other people that they feel like they can talk to, that they can go to when they need help, like the worst situation that they feel like, you know, at least one person can deal with one thing, one part of their life that they feel a little bit vulnerable about. And so as you were talking, Alex, I thought of, I also work with an organization called Circle of Discipline that does like, they teach boxing, but then through boxing, they teach leadership skills and they offer mentorship, and it's run by mainly Black men and Black women who are, you know, really just care about kids and care about their community and like make themselves available, make their community available. And I think that the more that we are able to support one another within community, it's easier to maintain our health. You know, if you got somebody you're going to go work out with, you got somebody you can talk to about, you know, an issue that you're dealing with, or, oh, I'm thinking about going to see a therapist. Have you done this before? You know, that sense of community is really strengthening and uplifting. And so I guess that's my main thing, is to try to open ourselves up to other people, because we're social beings. We actually need people. We need other people, and we need a variety of different people. Like, you know, there has to be diversity within the community. So I think that's the best way to kind of maintain our health and our identity as a community.
I love that. I love that. And it's so simple, like being vulnerable and being open to each other and to yourself. Like,
but it's like the hardest thing in the practice that I do my work through. It's what's called relational cultural theory. And so they have what's called the central paradox. And the central paradox basically states that humans, in the simplest terms, humans want to be seen as who they are, and we fear being seen as who we are. And so when we fear being seen as who we are, we put up a front of this mask. We wear a mask. And the more that we want to be seen as who we are, the more the mask comes up. And so there's this kind of way that we have to trick ourselves somehow to be like, okay, and you know, the opposite of shame is compassion. So if we're able to have compassion for ourselves, compassion for other people, it's easier to be able to share ourselves with other people, and it also makes it more comfortable for those other people to share themselves with us.
Definitely a muscle, and it's not an easy thing to do, but definitely necessary for a deeper life.
Mm-hmm.
Any last thoughts, Dr. Dressler? I don't want to if no pressure, but I just want to give you a chance to speak before we wrap up.
Oh, no, it's all good. Everything was well said. I agree. I think it's just like all good. And I think the last thing I'll just like say, yeah, give yourself grace. Like, yeah, like it's hard in the streets, to be honest. But we just need those like moments of just like giving ourselves grace and allowing ourselves to feel what we feel.
Thank you. Thank you. That does it. Thank you so much, everybody. That is the ending of our program. Thank you for the panelists. So thank you so much. I feel like we are in the cusp of our podcast. I think this should be like a monthly thing that we should do from now on. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And thank you so much for folks for engaging and attending. it helps us to know that we're not alone in providing this event for y'all. And it kind of just, this whole conversation reminds me of like when I was younger, my mom, like if we had a big rug that we would set in the winter time just to like keep our house warmer, and everybody had a job. Folks would like, some people would move the chairs, some people would like carry the rugs. So everybody had a purpose and a goal to make our house warm. And I feel like that's like essentially life and what we're all trying to do. Like we all have a purpose, we all have a calling to make this a good experience for all of us. You know, it's not we're gonna, I mean, like it's a moment that we're all sharing together. So to be a healthy community, we all have to play our part. With that being said, in closing, our next event is offering reflection and centering our youth. It's a discussion to center ourselves and reflect on how Black History Month inspires our future through our children, legacy, and present actions. And I just want to just let everybody know that the link for the chat for our engagement page is posted. Please check out what we have in store for you and how you can stay connected to the panelists. And please continue the conversation by answering our final question of the day, which is how can mindful mental health practices support a better future? And I just want to do a quick shout out before we leave for Reviving Roots. As you mentioned, your sanctuary membership is coming up. So if folks would like to sign up and identify as Black folks, please sign up. It's beautiful. You get massages monthly if you want to. There's a yoga space, just connecting with other Black people, a bonus. So please do sign up and stay engaged that way. The Innocence Project, they do have a website and the book is out. So please put that on your readings list. We all have connection to our kids. So I think it's definitely a must read for everybody. With that being said, we will see you next Thursday, same time at noon. Till then, take care, everybody.
Thank you.
This was great. Thank you.
It was.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. It's good to meet both of you as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, you too as well.
Such a
That
small
was so
world, and all of
awesome.
you are doing beautiful things.
All right.
See y'all.
Bye-bye.
See you later.
Dilson, Marvel, and I did set up a debrief if you guys want to join that one too, to
Okay.
Kiki or whatever.
I'm
Perfect.
trying to, how do I stop this? How do I stop this recording? I don't even, oh, got it.